children, babies, everybody. Welcome to the Political Hour. I'm Marielle Summers, and I am running on Keisha Cole time this morning. I have to apologize, folks, but I am just so overjoyed. This may very well be my favorite. Um, this may very well be my favorite political hour that I've done thus far. It's Black History Month. February it is, and I thought it was very appropriate for us to do an episode of politics in Black history. So here's the thing, right? We live in a society where we're so busy keeping up with what is currently happening. Day by day, we're watching what's happening and trying to keep up with that. We're trying to connect the dots from history, and intermittently we get a glimpse or a story or an individual that tells us something about our history. But one thing that we know for sure is that America's education system, the overall, I guess, way that the black story is told and remembered is very limited. I'm only 30 years old. I went to school not that long ago, graduated, and what I know about the K through 12 system is when it comes to politics, when it comes to government, when it comes to arts, literature, culture, um, we have a very basic surface storytelling of what African Americans have contributed to society. If anything, we're told almost the same story year after year. Um, when it comes to the school system, we're not tested on anything related to Black history, and if that's not given to us, that's not given to any American. It's not given to the larger society. And so, what I love about Black History Month, what I love about what we do in February is it's an internal thing. You know, it's a time for us as African Americans to learn new stories, to venture out into new parts of our history. It's so expansive, it's so deep, it's so detailed, and it's so beautiful. And we don't have time sometimes day to day. We don't have the luxury to sit and go back and reflect on history 365. I don't it doesn't mean that we shouldn't. And we should as much as we can, and we should force the issue as much as we can. But America has accepted this tradition that was created by an African American part of society called Negro History Week, that grew in the 70s post the civil rights era into Black History Month. It was accepted then by, I think it was President Ford. Um, this was something that many understood as what we need to keep these stories relevant, not for the sake of, appeasing us for a month, but for the sake of diving deeper. Because it's not just about us. It's not just about what's happening now. It's about the external value that it has on the rest of America, because nobody's been told these stories. So we have to look at Black history. I love Black History Month, and I would be doing us an injustice if I did not, use this hour, this political hour, to look at some political Black history. Not only that, I love it. I'm gonna very much enjoy talking about this stuff, but I wanted to open up with that, because that is why this month is important. It tells our stories. It gives us a chance to reflect. It helps us have pride in who we are and and where we've come from. But not only that, it lets the rest of our American neighbors of other ethnicities and cultures be aware of our contributions, to put some respect on our existence, and to also be concerned about disparities and inequities, to also want to help aid the mistakes that have been made in the past by the people in power who are part of other cultures. You know, if they don't know the history either, if they're only told and paint, if they're only told and painted one side of the picture, how can we ever, expect anyone to have any perspective? So I love Black History Month. Let's keep it going. Let's hype it. Let's push it. Let's make every business, every organization, let's raise flags. Let's do it all. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the politics in Black history. Now, primarily, I want to talk kind of chronologically about it, but I want to speak specifically about the African American plight. So I'll speak in general because our history doesn't begin. I mean, African American history, obviously African American, it begins in America, but the Black history, the glory of who dark melanin skinned people are, does not begin in America. It does not begin in slavery. It doesn't begin from this place of despair. It actually begins, like much of the rest of the world, in a way that evolution gave them this glory, in a sense. And there are great African kingdoms that sprung up from, just traditional history as it relates to how other societies developed. Africa developed it very similarly, and great things were happening. How does that relate to politics? Well, let's explain it, folks. So the thing about it is there were great African kingdoms. You had these kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai that are most. Before I get into it, though, I want to plug my references because I think it's very important before I just go start talking. That you guys know, this is not just all my opinion. I've studied this stuff. I've looked at this stuff, and I recommend. This is gonna be first book. I got a few books, but this is the first book that I recommend. It's called From Slavery to Freedom, and you see Obama on the cover. It's written by John Hope Franklin and Evelyn Higginbotham. And those, John Hope Franklin is just a respected, very well respected African American historian. He wrote this book several decades ago, and this is actually the 9th edition. So you had folks come back and study the work and contribute to it. And so this is the 9th edition. So anything that I'm going to say here, I recommend you go on Amazon, spend your $13 and get you a used copy and have an African American glossary that you can refer back to. I use it like a index book. I use it definitely as a reference book. It's not a front to back cover read, but this is our history told from the eyes of people who dedicated their lives, Black people, to telling it. And there are plenty Black historians. We have Henry Louis Gates. I'm sure you guys see him. He's the guy with the glasses. He's always kind of telling some story about our history. There's Brian Stevenson, who's opened the Legacy Museum, the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. And if you look at what these people have been able to piece together in contrast to what it is that we were taught and we were told, you start to understand where the gaps exist in our society. You start to understand, this is the big picture. So let's skip right to it. So you had these great kingdoms, right? You had Ghana. You had Ghana come along in the 7th century, and it lasted until about the 13th century. Ghana, Mali, Songhay. Mali was about 13th to 15th, and then Songhay lasted from about the 15th to the 16th century. And if you follow general history, you'll know that's when the Atlantic slave trade really took off, right? That's when things really started to be entrenched here in America in the 16th and 17th centuries in terms of importing people of color as property and for economic benefit. So the last great kingdom fell in the late 16th century, and that's interesting. But you look at this stuff, and it's like, okay, well, what does that have to do with politics? That all sounds like history. Here's the crazy part, is that these societies were organized. They were organized societies. They had, different, roadmaps. They had infrastructure. They had trading going on, and it wasn't just local trading. It was international trading. You had people coming from Europe down to our motherland and respectfully trading for legitimate items. It wasn't immediately a pillage of Africa. Africa was respected. It was not until around it was not until around the era of Mansa Musa. I don't know if everyone's familiar with who Mansa Musa was, but go look him up. If you Google the words Mansa Musa right now, you'd find that he was an African man who is considered to be the richest man of all time, with more wealth than anyone could possibly fathom. This man, his story is told and remembered through other cultures because he made this epic journey to Mecca, and he took thousands and thousands of people with him. Slaves he took with him. He took soldiers. He took his wives. He camels and livestock and gold, more gold. So this man's going from, this is in North Africa. This is actually happening in Northwest Africa. This kingdom of Mali, that Mansa Musa, this rich man, this rich guy who sets eyes on Africa, right? He makes this journey and he sets eyes on Africa. People are writing about it. People are talking about it because he's crashing economies. He's giving out gold. He's coming through with this long parade of glory. He journeys to Mecca, and as history tells it, right, he brings back the idea of slavery not as an indentured servitude. You see, people will tell you, oh, well, black people had slaves too. And this is very well true. Unfortunately, during that time period of the world, slavery existed in many societies. It existed in Europe. It existed in Latin America. It existed, certainly in the Middle East and certainly in Africa, right? And so you have this idea, though, about what it means to be an enslaved person at that time. You are able to work your way out of slavery at that time. You're able to, you have a village, right? And I have a village, right? My village conquers your village. Make all of your people our servants, our slaves, our indentured servants. But in many cases, you have this understanding that you can earn your way up out of it. I'm not saying that it's right, but I'm saying that it wasn't an exchange of property, that it wasn't based on the color of your skin, that it was a deeper rooted part of society at that time. And so you have Mansa Musa bring this idea back that selling people to foreign nations is acceptable. This is in the late 15th century where, people are starting to get out into the world. People are starting to journey around, and America is discovered. We know the story of this nation because we had to study the story of this nation. We know the traditional story of this nation as America tells it. But this is what's happening in Africa as America's developing, right? And something crazy happens in the 1600s, and it happens here in America, but Africans have no idea that it's happening, and it's called the Black Codes. And this is where the politics comes into it, right? The Black Codes in America, they made it so that a person who was born a slave would die a slave. That a person of African American skin tone would be designated to that. And all of these rules about how we were to be property came into being, into law, into this country. That's where the politics comes into it. You didn't have this on the other side, this understanding in Africa. You didn't have this realization. You had this idea of trade because we had been trading with these European nations. We had been trading with these foreign powers for centuries, legitimately getting respect, visiting palaces. Go back and check. You didn't have this on the other side. You can go back and check from the 14th century, 15th, 16th, at all of these African kings who were accepted into these European palaces. And in the 1600s, 1660s to be precise, the Black Codes came into being in the United States of America, unbeknownst to Africans who kept shipping their people over here for whatever gain, It works, unfortunately, for hundreds of years. It works for hundreds of years, and it's not until the great kingdom of Songhai comes along that the African infrastructure is weakened. This expansive network that began in the 7th century with Ghana is now weakened by the time we get to the 16th century because we've started shipping so many of the people who are a part of the infrastructure, the powers, out of the country through shadow slavery. So let's fast forward, right? Let's fast forward. What's happening in America over time is that slavery is expanding in the South, and in the North, there's like this industrialism thing that's happening. And so you have these differing ideologies about how an economy can operate. One that focuses on just this kind of like true capitalism, and the other that focuses on people as property, people as property to further an economic gain. And so the harsh realities of what our ancestors went through as enslaved people, the harsh realities of that are tied up in all types of economics and politics. So here we are now. You have let's skip 100 years, right? 1776, America comes into being. The Constitution of this nation is written, and in it, because the practice has been happening for 100 years, there's a lot of things that happen in that 100 years. There's a lot of expansion that happens in that 100 years. We start gaining new territories, and we learned all about this, the Louisiana Purchase, and the Manifest Destiny, and how America expanded west. But what we weren't taught in school is how slavery influenced all of this stuff. How trying to keep the privilege of using other human beings as property influenced so much of how America grew, right? And so at a certain point, the North is starting to be this industrial society, and importing enslaved people into like Virginia and like these East Coast, towns, it just becomes unacceptable, right? But we get Louisiana, and people realize that Florida isn't that long. It isn't that hard to just go around. And instead of dropping people here on the East Coast, we'll continue channeling and funneling them in through the South. And that's what Brian Stevenson's that's the power in this museum in Alabama, folks. A ticket to Alabama is cheap, hotel is cheap, and the tickets are not that expensive to this museum. But if you go there and you really get a grasp of how American politics is all weaved around people trying to preserve the importation, the system of enslaved people for economic purposes, for economic gain. It wasn't just evil to be evil. It's there. And so here you have it, right? Where your country is developing, and at some point there starts to be this ideological conflict, right? There starts to be, should these new states be slave states, or should these new states be free states? Should they be open to the philosophies of the North and the South? This is where America starts to be tattered, guys. This is where you start to see the seeds of the Civil War starting to set themselves in, because not because of the harsh and brutal realities that African Americans are facing. That is the political part about it, guys. These folks were not worried about all of the things that we learn about our history in movies, all of the things that they want us to focus on, and how we're represented in the present day. This is the importance of Black history. This is the importance of understanding where politics lies in Black history. It wasn't ever about how we were treated. It wasn't ever about making life better for the Black person. It was always about the dollar. The dollar. The fact that people, and then you have these cases that you hear about, right? And I'll bring the law into it, right? So America's happening, 1776, we come into being, and for the purposes of signing the Constitution, we're considered 3/5. It's right there in the original Constitution. You can Google it. That we would be considered 3/5 of a person's, but we would be property, right there in the Constitution. Why is that important, right? Because America continues to exist about 100 years later, maybe 1850s, 1860s, this starts to become a problem, because Black people are not down with just being indentured servants and slaves. Like we escaped. People started escaping like nobody's business, and when they would get to the North, a lot of times they could get a job, and one man did. His name was Dred Scott. I'm sure you guys heard the name Dred Scott before, but the significance of Dred Scott is huge, because it would define how America would see us for much longer than it should have. So this guy, he is enslaved, and long story short, because the political hour has a long way to go through history, and I want to get through all of it. His case ends up in the Supreme Court because he was living as a free man in the North, and it was being challenged. And the Supreme Court at that point in time, and check this out, the guy on the $20 bill, Andrew Jackson, he's the guy who made the decision, right? And they got him on the 20. He said, just if this is the example he made verbatim. I can't quote him verbatim, but He said, if my property goes into another place, it doesn't mean that it's not my property. So if you were enslaved at that time, the technical thing, you ran to the north and you were free. But what Dred Scott pretty much determined was, if you escaped and your owner came and found you, or you were caught, that there was no freedom for the African American. Well, it wasn't until President Lincoln came through and crashed that. And there's a lot more history. History's so rich. I hope I can revisit much of this throughout the month. There's John Brown's raid. There are uprisings that happen all throughout the South that make the people there feel threatened. And we'll get into all of these specifics, guys. But what happens here is you get a president who understands that the threat is not how these people are being treated. The threat isn't that these people are being lesser. The threat is, as America expands, there's nothing stopping these people from the South from making slavery and the economic powerhouse in this nation. And the Union couldn't stand that way. They couldn't stand that way. The Dred Scott case allowed for people in the South to say, just because somebody's up north doesn't mean that they're not my property. What was stopping them from opening franchises with enslaved people? What was stopping them from expanding slavery into the north through, the many ways that capitalism allows? So it had to be outlawed. Slavery had to be outlawed. It was the only way to cut the head off this economic system that threatened the Union. And the South wasn't having it, but it was never about our rights. It was never about equity. It was never about us being a part of this society. It was just about the fact that we can't be used as property. And that's the political part of it. That's the political part of it. So you have 100 years go by, right? And you have this president who then says, okay, I'm going to sign the 13th Amendment. And we know the history. The South secedes. We learn all about the Civil War. But I guarantee you, if you were 30 years old like me, or a few years younger, a few years older, they never tied in how the Civil War was about slavery. You learned everything about the Confederates, about the Union, about this guy, that guy. But we never, as African Americans, learned that it was all about keeping us as property or not, period. Political, right? Why is that important? Because history's all tied together. So how much time do we got here? Oh, we got a little bit of time. So we won't take a break because I started on Keisha Cole time, so we won't take a break because I want to try and get through this and tell the real story, or at least paint the framework for it and just kind of build out on it through this Black History Month as we talk about the politics of Black history. So we get to this place where the nation is at war with itself, and we know all about what happens. The Union technically wins, and Reconstruction then starts, right? Now, this is, I think, one of the richest parts of our history that's untold. The biggest disservice that the education system has done for us is to not tell the glory of what Reconstruction was for African Americans. Here you are, a nation of formerly enslaved people, freed from bondage and literally being someone's property, to now you have to go out and make your own decisions. They didn't give us land. They didn't give us, I'm sure you folks have heard the promise 40 acres and a mule, right? it was during Reconstruction, this Freedmen's Bureau that was to patrol the South and make sure that people were African Americans were black people were freed, that we weren't enslaved, that the people in the South were doing what the Union had told them to do. During this time, we excelled like crazy. You had African Americans in government for the first time. We were elected. If you go back and look at who was the first black person to run for president, this happened in the late 1800s. If you look at the first black congressman, 1800s U.S. congressman. In some areas of the South, African Americans began to control whole areas of politics. We dove right in. Patents. If you look at the patent list, you see, as the workers in the society of the South, we always were the creators and the mind behind the operation, but society didn't allow for us to celebrate any of that, right? We had to give that away. And so in the late 1800s, during this time, during Reconstruction, you see just hundreds of black inventors. I have a list here, but you have everything from like lawnmower, desk, table, biscuit cutters. Just look it up. Take your time this Black History Month to look up what black inventors have created, and it will literally blow your mind. We applied for these patents in the 1800s when we were finally able to. So very quickly, you didn't have African Americans you didn't have black people who were freed from being enslaved, who couldn't do anything. You had us, take off like a rocket. And that threatened the white society. That made them very, very afraid, right? And this is where you start to see the roots of what we are experiencing in the modern day. Reconstruction happens. African Americans start to make their own way, make their own name, become educated by the masses. And you see a rise of white supremacy. This is the first, it's not the first, right? Because we were formerly like enslaved by them. So it's not a wonder that they would retaliate at any little progression that we have. And that's the theme, in my opinion, of American history and American politics as it relates to African Americans. But it starts there. When we very first get our freedom and they see what we can do, backlash comes. The rise of the KKK, the first wave of it, the first rise of black persecution rises. And so we still, even though we're freed, we're isolated. And in the late 1800s, another important case, politics, Plessy versus Ferguson. I'm sure y'all have heard the name Plessy versus Ferguson, right? What's so important about Plessy versus Ferguson? Well, in the late 1800s, white people are like, in the South especially, are like, well, y'all can be free, but y'all can't use our stuff. And so there becomes a lot of like separate stuff, white only neighborhoods, white only everything. And so, this guy, Mr. Plessy, he is a fair-skinned fellow, red, high yellow. And, he goes and he goes to get on this train and it's like, the guy is telling him he's black. He has this sitting in the back. He gets arrested. So he sues and it gets all the way up to the Supreme Court. And his argument is, how can one determine that I'm a black man? Like, what? He couldn't even determine it. Is that fair? And the Supreme Court agreed with the white supremacist part of society and said separate but equal is fine. Separate but equal is legal as long as you have a train to sit on. That's all we have to do. We don't have to allow you to sit up front with the white folks. This is accepted in what we see, man, for the next, that's what 1891. Civil rights era came along in 1960s, and the laws finally ended that. So what you see for the next 60 years, 65 years is, again, like I said, now we're on the roots of what we see today. See, the seeds of it all happened after the Civil War. The seeds of it all happened once we got citizenship in this nation and became citizens of this nation. That's when the seeds of it all happened. But what we're talking about when we're talking about 1891, 1900, 1910s, now we're talking about the roots of what we see today. It's all connected. It's all related. It's all political. It's all economic. You see this separate but equal society that keeps us frozen with fear, that keeps us, limited. I won't say frozen, right? Because that's what I love about Black history. You constantly see Black people, despite what we were facing, despite the fear of death, say, I still have to go. If I perish, let me perish, but I'm going, right? I still have to go forward. And that is, that's something to be celebrated. That's what I love about our history. That's why I'm not afraid to dive deep in it, because you always find a gangster. You always find, whether it's a woman or a man, you're like, dang, they wasn't scared. They wasn't afraid. Negation and separation. And you have those attitudes not only operating inside of, people's minds, but you have them operating inside of our society, inside of our state houses, inside of our federal house, inside of every part of society that America touches. And so, despite this, African Americans continue to excel. So here's where things get crazy. As it relates to greater American history, right? The world is expanding. The Black plight and the problems that we're experiencing under the thumb of America, that's one part of the story. But the other part of the story is, simultaneously, while we're trying to gain our rights and gain our freedoms here in this country, there's things happening in the globe that are impacting American society. The wars are beginning to happen. We're starting to transition from this era of empire to this era of nation states, to this era of hierarchy and sovereignty. And some societies still operate like this. You still get some societies where the king really does have the power, and he's got to have a son, and the son's going to be the next king. And in the early 1900s, late 1800s, there was so much of that still going on in the world. But the age of empire died down on a global level in the age of the nation state. And that's what made America so strong, is because we had built the infrastructure for a nation state in 1776. This country did. It didn't include African Americans. But in terms of competing on a global scale, this country never started as an empire. We never had a king. We never, it wasn't about sovereignty. It was capitalism and democracy and the Constitution and all of these things. Even if it didn't apply to all citizens, it gave us a head start as the world transitioned away from the age of empire to the age of nation state, because we were already a strong nation. It was the United States of America. And so what's happening, the wars, the effects that it's having, the Great Depression's happening, the effects of society on all Americans, not just the Black American, right? On all Americans, forces the government to reevaluate itself. And so simultaneously, you have Black Americans who have prepared themselves for a time such as this. You have your Thurgood Marshalls. You have your Asa Philip Randolphs. You have your Carter G. Woodsons. You have your Du Boises, your Marcus Garveys, your Elijah Muhammads. You have your Mary McLeod Bethunes and your Ida B. Wells and your Ella Bakers, and your Mary McLeod Bethune, Madam C.J. Walkers. You have Black Americans who were groomed and raised and prepared for a time such as that. So as America found itself tilting on its heels, they forced the issue for America to bring inclusion, to bring equity, to bring justice to our community in their context. That is why we celebrate Black History Month. That is what needs to be examined and uplifted as it relates to how we continue to move forward. Folks, we are always up against the mighty hand of the American government. If you don't believe me, here's another book for you to check out. I'm going to plug it here. It's called The Color of Law. The Color of Law. What I love about The Color of Law is it looks at the way legally America continued the oppression of African Americans throughout the 1900s. So here we are, we're talking about, the 1800s, we're on to 1920s, and we have America changing. Around the 1930s, there's this understanding that this KKK tyranny type junk, it's got to be outlawed. Like, we can't really allow for people to be lynching. Like, we have to find another way to oppress. It's here, and it's in this book. Read it and look for yourself. That the American government system starts to entrench some of the segregation, starts to put in some of the redlining. And so this era, a lot of people call it Jim Crow, right? National Housing Act of 1934 declares that everywhere in America there must be segregated communities. The Housing Act of 1937 declares that people who are developing housing communities must take this into consideration. This backfires on them big time, because what we know and what a lot of when I talk to my brothers, I call them my woke brothers. What we know is that when we were segregated in our own communities, we thrived. We had Black businesses on every corner. We had, Black doctors and lawyers and dentists, and, everybody was respectful and people knew the rules. And they tried to keep us down, but we couldn't stay there. That's the story of Black history, and that's the story that needs to be told. If you look, these are political policies, folks. These are coming at the hand of the government. Here we are, though, with thriving Black businesses, thriving growth. And this is what happens for the next 30, 40 years, right? Civil Rights Act and definitely Brown versus the Board of Education definitely shakes up how the board looks. And I think that's more of like, I think we're at like the branches. We're talking about the tree. But this is the base, you know what I mean? This is the base, this Jim Crow era, this era from the 1920s to about the 1960s, where, you know, segregation and the economic system is just set up against us, where we just don't have a clean shake at being able to compete with the white society when it comes to business and infrastructure and expansion, where the hard hand of the American government, the weight of law enforcement, and just the illness of segregation are used to keep us from economically competing. But what it can't stop is us from growing. So by the 1960s and beyond, by the time we reach this 1960s era, how much time do I got here? I'm running just a little late. All right, I'm gonna run a little over. So I'll finish this and we'll come back next week and talk about like mass incarceration and the post civil rights era, like post King, post X, and what's been happening in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and try and talk about. But our history is so deep, it's so rich, it's so much to talk about. But I want to plug. This is the last book I want to plug. It's called St. Petersburg, Florida, the Black America series. And what this book right here contains is just so much of what was happening during this trunk period that I'm talking about, right? This 1920s, post Reconstruction, even to the 1960s, to the Civil Rights era, and we can see for ourselves what our people were up against, what they were doing and accomplishing, and hopefully, kind of gain some more understanding and perspective about our own history. So I am Mhariel Summers. I am so excited to be doing this Black History Month. Guys, thank you for tuning in to the Political Hour, and let's do it again. Let's do it again next Friday.
You're listening to Power Plug Radio.